Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Hello, Gamer Nation, and welcome to the Dice Pool Podcast, covering everything that you've ever wanted to know about how to run and play in the Genesys role-playing game by Fantasy Flight Games. I'm your host, GM Hurley, and this episode we've got a very interesting show for you. But for the moment, let me introduce you to the only people who answer my call to assemble, my co-host and friends, GM Huz, GM Flano, and GM Caitlin. How are we all?
Swimmingly.
Swimmingly?
I don't know, that was just the first word that came to my head.
You have been playing entirely too much Sea of Thieves.
Oh, that is entirely accurate. Very good point. And you've just stolen what I was going to be up to this week. So that's pretty much it.
There you go.
Not enough Sea of Thieves.
This is true.
So
We had to stop so we could come and do the podcast. But
Right,
that's okay.
right. Very good. So, Mike, what have you been up to?
what have I been up to? Sea of Thieves? No. Sea of Thieves, middle of moving house, so that's fun. Can't wait for that ordeal to be over and done with. So packing and etc. I own a lot of stuff, so that's a pain in the butt. But that's okay. Sea of Thieves, RPGs like normal. Actually ran a Star Wars game the other night where we played Stormtroopers.
That was fun.
Yes.
But Stormtroopers with a bit of a twist.
Stormtroopers with a bit of a twist, that's correct. It was the 80th, and if you guys are familiar with our Facebook page, I put up a photo of some painted Stormtroopers from Legion, and a bit of a fluff background of to who the 80th are, and they're basically a Stormtrooper Legion who have basically been set up by the Empire to take down organised crime. So they spend weeks and months at a time deep in enemy lines, in hut space, all the riskier sort of areas of the galaxy where the Empire usually sort of steer clear because, you know, Black Sun, the Hut clans or whoever has large influence and control. These guys basically show up and they kick in doors. They don't muck around. They're there to really enforce the rule of the Empire, even to people who think they might be above the rule. And so, they're a hardened sort of group of stormtroopers, which kind of makes them a cool aspect for role-playing because they have a lot more dimension than most stormtroopers. So you can play, the characters can really get into the roles and play very, very animated characters like GM Hurley. He was playing a very no nonsense.
Yeah, very regimented.
Yeah, sort of no nonsense, regimented sergeant. I can imagine him always having a 5 o'clock shadow and a scarred up face and probably a whitened eye, and he's pretty beaten up. GM Flano was playing he's very indoctrinated and proper, you know, the ideal stormtrooper basically. But the reason he ended up being the 80th was because he was a
Mary Allen.
So he sort of was limited. That was his ceiling essentially.
Near human, yeah.
He's near human. But in the 80th, he had the chance to climb the rungs because the 80th are always in the shadows. They're never the poster boys of the Empire.
Yeah,
so you can be a near human and sort of become more than what you're limited to normally. And GM Caitlin had a really cool character, which was a very strong silent type who used a sword/whip and would just basically step into the enemy and just hack them to bits and not really question or take any of their nonsense.
Bit of an executioner for the squad as well, yeah.
Yes, particularly so when they can stand still and I can actually roll decently. That did happen once, and it was magical when it did take place. But yeah, very, very much so, which is always very interesting when you've got a captain who is very regimented. And she's the type of character that's just not going to... She actually is a mute, so when GM Huz says... Well, by choice, she's very strong silent. She doesn't speak at all. So it's always very interesting when it comes to role-playing out with the different personalities of the other players. Because she's just going to be silent. Next minute she's there, next minute she's not, and she's just run into the whole crowd of people like Leroy Jenkins effectively without the yelling.
And last night was Advantage night, I think. Like everybody has like Despair night or Triumph night, but yeah, it was like we couldn't hit anything but we would roll or during our checks, we were just doing advantage, and massive amounts anyway.
Oh, you were succeeding a lot of checks. Like there was a skill challenge that came up initially.
Just not me. I was the only one who failed in that skill challenge. Everyone else had successes.
That's true.
Not I.
And to paint the picture, the skill challenge was a crashed Imperial ship with an angry crowd because the whole start of the adventure was taking place in the deep undercity of Nar Shaddaa. It was a very rundown, very rough neighborhood essentially, and an Imperial scout shuttle had crashed in the middle of a busy marketplace and it crashed through countless number of people. So the locals weren't too pleased with this, of course. And then being Empire to start off with, they weren't pleased at all. So when this occurred, they were a bit of an angry mob. So these guys had to come down in a Delta class shuttle, which is what you see Krennic in Rogue One moving about via. So that's what they have. This was the party the PCs had to move around Nar Shaddaa, which is pretty cool. And they had a bit of a skill challenge to diffuse a situation and disperse the crowd. And it was a bit of a knife edge sort of situation because the skill challenge was 5 successes before 2 failed checks. So it could be one of those very volatile situations where if they had failed ultimately to disperse this crowd, they would have had an angry mob pressing down on them while they're trying to recover what's left in this crashed shuttle, which worked out well because they managed to they expertly disperse the crowd. However, they were ambushed by a bunch of goons, essentially, and fortunately for them, there was no angry mob attacking them at the same time. So, yeah, of course, I planned for that to be a one-shot. However, we got through maybe 1/3 of it, 1/4 of it, so we plan on picking up it again in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we didn't record it, just in case anybody asks, because I know that every time that we do play a game, that's probably the first question that we ask is, have you recorded it? So, no, unfortunatately, we didn't. But
this was a very last-minute game. Like, we were meant to be playing Stars of Outnumber that night. Josh had to cancel because of work, so I went, all right. And we used your I used your
Adventure design
sheet at work on Friday that afternoon before the session started, and I made the entire adventure in the space of 20 minutes.
There you go. See, it's that easy. Talking about encounters, we'll get on to that shortly, though. So, Martin, what have you been up to?
Sea of Thieves.
I'm clearly only one who doesn't get into it.
Nope.
And that's fine.
I just don't have time, but that's okay.
You don't have to.
No,
it's
I
okay.
know. It just seems to be the in thing. So,
Well, out of 4 people, that's not the majority of the community. Let's put it out that way. You're just outnumbered in this little small
Right,
room.
sure.
Yeah.
I was going to say 3 in every 4 people.
But most of my regular games got cancelled because I haven't actually been well. So haven't been up to much more than that, or Rainbow Six, Siege on the computer. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I've been very boring and sick.
Poor guy. All right, Caitlin, what have you been up to?
What have I been up to?
Go on, say it.
A lot of sea and a lot of thieves is what I have been up to.
As it continues.
It does continue. It's actually really interesting because the game's so basic in itself. There's actually not a lot to it. But what I love about it is that we basically create our own fun with it, which I think is why we play it so often. Is because we troll. And we make our own fun out of that game, and it's just really cool. So I have been doing that quite a lot still to this day.
There's been a lot of fun moments we've had.
Amazing moments, many crashes.
Yep.
Many
sneaky sandbars.
Lots of commandeering other people's ships and sending them off into the sunset without them on it.
And getting them to rage quit.
Oh, that was amazing. Good
Yep.
night. We made people rage quit because they couldn't defeat us.
And we had no cannonballs left in our ship.
No, we were completely defenseless, and we still managed to take them
ran
out.
out of planks.
Yeah, they had us, but then they couldn't handle someone boarding them and stabbing them in the back. And they scuttled their ship and quit.
But I should also mention that my computer is still screwed up and I can't play Sea of Thieves on my... I've been playing on my laptop, which is quite frustrating.
This has been going on for a month now. Right.
Yeah, he's playing a fossil, so what
Yeah.
do you expect?
It's
Actually,
fine.
if you recall, his computer exceeds all expectations.
Let's just say Sam Neill would be very fascinated with your computer.
Spend no expense. But other than
so
that,
if you'd like to donate to...
well, actually, if there is going to be a donation, it should be to me because I don't have a PC at
true.
this time, and
Yeah.
it breaks
Oh,
my
that's right.
heart.
You're an Apple user, aren't
Because
you?
I have an Apple. I'm not an Apple user in terms
it's
of I don't
not
use
by
Apple to
choice.
game. I do have an Xbox and a PlayStation.
All right.
But that doesn't actually quite work because the only reason why we're all in the Sea of Thieves is because it's cross-compatible.
Yes.
We can
Yeah.
all play together.
we're blessed
Yeah.
in that aspect because that's quite rare.
It is
To
rare.
get a cross-platform system. So me and Martin are playing on PC and Caitlin
Yeah.
stuck on Xbox, but who's complaining because it still works? So
True.
It does.
True.
It does. It just means that like when it comes to like trying to shoot people, it's a little bit more difficult. Whereas Mike is laughing at people who are on Xbox and he's just shooting them very, very easily. But other than that, we did do the one shot of the 880th, which was fantastic. I absolutely loved my character and her weapon. It's amazing. And we also did have a Stars Without Number campaign, not the one that was cancelled, but we did have one before that, which was really, really awesome. It was actually really cool because GM Flano's character got a little bit more of a spotlight on the
Yep,
character.
which was
and it
good.
Yeah, it was really cool to see it develop. And mind you, I was slightly distracted at that campaign purely because we got to play with Josh's puppy, Nala, which is highly dangerous around me. If there's animals, I'm just completely distracted. But it was still a really awesome session. So that's pretty much my world.
well, I was excited about that session because I managed to use my last laugh upgrade on my revolver.
Yes, which I made sure that I selected for the 880th character that I created,
Yes.
which is in the GM Huzz's Sci-Fi Armory. And the last laugh is...
Last laugh is a upgrade for your weapon or pistol that essentially turns it into a grenade. So you throw your weapon, it explodes, your weapon's obviously destroyed, but it's when you really need that grenade because you've got nothing left that can hurt
Yeah.
something.
I've run out of ammo.
So
Wait.
essentially what had happened was we were trying to track down this big gribbly and our characters ended up being in this hunting competition with this
Yeah.
big, affluent megacorp owner or something like that. What can I
Sort
explain?
of, yeah,
very
like-
affluent sort of rich man on a seedy world.
Yeah.
Challenges to a hunting competition on his private estate, and we tracked down this big monster. It was a big skill challenge. We're doing really, really well. We set up this big final shot with this rail rifle we had. My character's the gunner, and I took the shot. And of course, odds are 100% in my favor. I had like 200 blue dice and 30 yellow dice, and I still somehow failed because it's me.
Yeah.
And so,
Passed everything to you for that
Yes.
shot.
geez, and the creature ended up charging my character. And last check, I threw my pistol into its mouth and killed it.
Kaboom.
And if anyone's ever played the Borderlands games as well, that would also be something very familiar, except in Borderlands.
Borderlands.
In Borderlands, it just regenerates after that, so you're constantly throwing it after it reloads.
Yeah.
I love that. So if you do a Borderlands Genesis
That's
setting,
true.
you could use the last laugh and not have it be destroyed at the end of it, which would be even more amazing in game. That would be so cool.
Flip a story point and you get it back.
Ooh,
That would be, that's cool.
I love Borderlands. That would be amazing. So Ian, what have you been up to?
Well, I've kind of been in a little bit of a funk because, well, it's post-con funk, as I like to call it, or post-con depression.
It's a very real thing.
It is a real
Oh,
thing.
no,
So,
I've never been to one.
well, we're going to change that anyway. Well, let's hope we are.
What
But
about... Yeah, I think there should be a depression as well, seeing everyone's
Yes.
posts about
Yeah,
the con,
yeah.
because it was very real for me.
No, you know what I'm in right now? I'm going to post con high because I like to watch you suffer.
Oh God, that went.
Schadenfreude.
Wow.
This is taking a very adversarial
Yes.
turn right here.
In episode 10, that's when things went bad.
Yes, into party, into host, into PC conflict. How to deal?
Look, I'll be the first to admit I did rub it in just a little bit that I was going. So
It looked like an absolutely amazing event.
Look,
looked really
was. It was. But yeah, it's been a little while since I've come back now. But, you know, hopefully I'll get into a little bit more gaming as we go. But yeah, so I got to play in the in Mike's campaign with the Killjoys, which is what they're referred to. And yeah, it was. It's just good to be a player occasionally because, you know, I GM a lot. But to be doing that, that's fantastic. And the other thing that we've also been doing is obviously some of the live play stuff for Night's Edge, which has been turning out quite nicely. So, you know, every alternate fortnight or every alternate 2 weeks, because some people don't use the word fortnight, or so I learnt while I was overseas.
Unless it's in reference to the game. I think that's a pretty big big term at the
No, a
moment.
fortnight is a knight which guards a fort.
That is what it is.
Right.
See, there's lots of different interpretations
He's there
of
for 2
it.
weeks, though.
Yeah.
His
Yeah.
duty changes.
Yeah.
So anyway, people will be able to listen to those episodes as well. So and they've been a lot of fun to run. But the thing that I've been having the most fun with, other than running a couple of Star Wars sessions as well on my Sunday night game with Junkyard Heroes, is to delve into the realms of Terranoth, which should be, by the time that people are listening to this, it should be in everybody's hot little hands.
Only if we had a copy. Wait, we do.
We do. After thanks to some friends of mine who were kind enough, as I mentioned in the last episode, to donate that to me as fans of the show.
And GM Hurley has given me the copy now, so he's also very
Temporarily.
generous.
Just sharing the generosity. It's absolutely beautiful to
Come
see.
on, guys.
And
You have your own copies, you know.
We do plan on doing a full-on report of this book at some point.
Oh,
However,
absolutely.
there is one important, crucial thing we need to mention right now with this book.
What's that?
It smells amazing.
That's referring back to way back to episode 1 when we were talking about the smell of a book.
It's important. Anyone who appreciates a good hardcover book
I agree.
in the gaming world enjoys the smell.
I agree.
It's on level with like new electronics smell or new toys smell. Like,
So we've all had a little bit of a brief look at the book. What would be, just briefly, because we, as Martin, you've said that we'll do an episode, we'll do a review episode, and then we'll probably do very similar to what we did with Sam.
Yes.
That we'll go and do a bit of a QA with one of the designers, I would suggest, because there's a lot in there.
Well, it's been said that they might be interested. We'll have to check with them, but yes.
I can confirm after my trip to Gamer Nation Con
Keen.
that they will definitely be jumping on board with that, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Mike, what was your first impression of this book, other than the fact that it's awesome?
First impression of the book. First up, I didn't know what to expect, to be honest, because obviously the first of its kind.
Yeah.
However, I just love the entire format of the book in terms of its theme. It's got this really, really cool old scripture sort of look to it. The pages are all done as sort of, what would you call that? Parchment look. And it's beautiful. Like, I was expecting it to just be essentially a carbon copy of the Genesis book, that really stark white and whatnot. But however, this is quite clearly a good indication of what's to come. Each setting book is going to be very, very tailored to the setting it's in.
It copies the tone of the setting.
Exactly. And they've done a marvelous job here. Like, there is just pages of fluff. And the fluff pages are written like scroll work.
That was my first impression, was that I could open that, like, any book that is for setting, I want it to have lots of story and fluff that I can get my hand, like, read and get my head around. Like, and the fact that I opened that up and I could look at 4 consecutive pages of nothing but story, that I love that.
Just to reinforce, the book is 260 pages, which is on par with the actual Genesis core rulebook.
Yep,
To
exactly.
give you an idea of how chunky it is.
But there's plenty of crunch as well.
Oh yeah.
Look, lots of crunch, lots of, as you say, there's lots of fluff, which I think is great, because it means then that, it is a setting book as opposed to just a rule book. But I think a bit for everyone, really.
Well, that's really the benefit of it being a separate book to the core rule book, is that they have the ability to focus more on the setting.
Yeah. They don't have to repeat the core rules again and again.
Exactly.
Exactly.
How about you, GM Caitlin?
I absolutely love the artwork in this. I think it actually provides, when talking about the tone of the setting, I think the images actually bring it to life in a way that, is it puts the stories and the fluff into reality, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. I love the races that are involved in it as well, and seeing all the different kinds. Like, I love seeing that kind of like expansion and thinking of things in different ways. Really, really loved that. But yeah, the artwork, second to none. Loved it.
13
As always from FFG. I have to say I am very partial with the FFG
They've done
artwork.
so well.
Yeah.
Because, 13 different races when you start breaking down all of the sub-races and whatever else. And how many talents are there? Something like
60
60, something like that. It's huge.
Yes.
So we've also got our first question from one of our listeners in regards to that, but we'll get onto that later on. So yeah.
Something as well that I really enjoy about this Terra North book is how they've set out the lore. Because I'm someone who's fairly new to Terra North, and how they've done it towards the back of the book. They've got each of the lands,
Yes.
for better or less terms.
The major places.
It does, yeah, and they're major places, and each one's broken down with its own fluff and whatnot. But also, each of those lands contains all the relevant NPCs for that land. So, if you're new to the setting completely, you go, okay, well, let's go to this landscape, or this environment, and it automatically tells me which creatures are unique to there. So I don't have to thumb through pages and work out where what belongs where. It's already nicely laid out for me. So it makes GMing in this world really, really easy, which is cool.
One of the things that I'd like to mention is that there are still a lot of gaps as far as like your generic fantasy settings. And I think that that's probably an indication, and we've got no connection with FFG to tell us this is what's going on.
This is just pure speculation.
Pure speculation. But I would suggest that they will see how these books actually go as far as sales go, and once it's gone out to the general populace for a longer period of time, I think you might find that we might get expanded setting material for each of those areas type thing, which will be awesome.
There's only so much room in this, and they have packed so much in.
Agreed.
And there's more than enough to play a game in this world and not notice anything missing.
Yep.
It's just, I can see them producing more in the future.
Absolutely. All right, so before we get into the main part of the show, make sure to subscribe and review us on every platform that is bringing you our voices to your sound eyes. It's a huge help for us, and it also spreads the message to everybody out there that the podcast does exist. So subscribe, comment, review, message. We want to hear what you think and also what you want to hear next.
Also, don't forget, if you want to track us down to have a bit of a chat, send us emails, messages, or etc., you can find us by searching at Dice Pool Podcast on Facebook and Twitter. And don't forget, you can also find us on YouTube by searching Dice Pool Podcast. So that way you can listen to us while streaming us on YouTube, which is pretty cool. You can also get in touch with us via email at info@thedicepoolpodcast.com, or go old school and visit our website at www.thedicepoolpodcast.com.
Okay, so should we get into our show topic tonight?
Sure, that's what? Main part of the show? Something show? What's it called?
I think you'll find that's core of the show.
Core of the show.
And welcome to Core of the Show, the segment where we will take a deep dive into a topic concerning the Genesys role-playing game and, of course, gaming in general. Now, last episode, we spoke about creating episodic adventures, but tonight, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into adventures and take a look at encounter design. Now, the basis for what we're going to be talking about starts on page 239 of the core rulebook for Genesys, for those that are following on at home. Now, encounters can come in many different forms, such as combat encounters, hacking encounters, exploration or investigative encounters, social encounters, and vehicle encounters, just to name a few. Now, elements of each of these encounters can include environmental elements, bystanders, adversaries, exits and entrances. So tonight we're going to take a broad level view of how to design encounters in your adventures. So where do we start? Mike?
Well, I think the most obvious one, and all of us will do one pretty much all the time in Genesys, is combat encounters in general.
Yeah.
So that's probably where most of our discussion is going to fall.
Yeah.
But, the beauty about encounters in Genesys, no matter what it is, if it's a hacking, if it's a exploration, investigation, or even a social encounter, they could all technically happen at the same time or lead into one another seamlessly. So I think what we're going to be bringing here isn't so much a hard, crunchy, working out CR levels, if you're familiar with D&D, or what monsters to bring into a fight, etc. like that. It's more of a exercise in bringing you some helpful information, especially if you're newer GM too to the system.
And I mean, we will get to the crunchy sort of stuff, the magnified view of how to set up an encounter in the future.
Yeah.
That's to come.
Definitely.
And I think as well, it's important when we're looking at encounters to look at the type of adventure that you've created in your initial stage, and what we talked about in our previous episode. We've talked about, like what's going to be your climax point, what's going to be the investigation stage, and all the episodes that take place within that. So if you're looking at some of the things that the characters are needing to achieve, or what they need to do in each of those sessions, or what potentially could happen in each of those episodes, it can give you a good idea about how you're going to design each of those encounters around the actual story that you're trying to tell and what adventure is trying to happen. So looking at, combat being one of them, it is a huge element of any type of RPG that you create. I mean, a lot of RPGs are focused solely around combat.
Which is fine.
Yeah, dungeon running can be an amazing thing, but there's also different elements of that as well. The investigation, how are you going to problem solve? Where are you? What are you doing? And why are you doing it? But the other thing is that just because you have planned a combat encounter doesn't necessarily mean that's how the players are going to tackle that.
Yep.
That's right.
In that way.
Yep.
So as we mentioned before, they can feed into each other seamlessly. You might have a investigation that might end in a combat, and that's totally okay. But you might have a combat where we have planned it's going to be a combat, and one of the characters goes, no, we're going to talk this out like adults. And you've got to try and spin it on the spot.
Exactly. Like, for example, in the first live play episode that we did involving the Terranoth setting, where we had the homestead that you guys basically came up to, that was actually designed as a combat encounter that you would fight the bandits. But the choice that you guys decided to do, well, I think Mike sort of led the charge, so to speak, was to intimidate all of the bandits. So that combat encounter suddenly changed to a social encounter instead. And I think that's probably the key thing with any encounters, no matter what you're doing. Be prepared to turn it on its head a little bit, depending on what the players said or do.
I might add to that. It's be prepared to allow that to happen, but also allow it to happen.
Yeah.
I think a lot of traps is GMs will, especially on a pre-planned module, even when they've set up themselves, they'll go, well, this is meant to be a combat.
Yeah.
I will make it a combat no matter what.
don't-
And that, when the players have done nothing but, approach in a very smart manner to avoid a combat, the worst thing you can do is go, well, Joe Bloggs pulls out his pistol and shoots you.
That's going to
It's gonna
kill
It will.
their enjoyment.
It actually goes across each of them as well.
Exactly.
Because say you've got an investigation encounter and you have as a GM, you have very set in your mind, no, the key to the safe is going to be behind the picture on the wall that the players have to ask about and have to find. And if they spend all that time trying to find the particular thing that you have in your mind, because that's how it's supposed to play out as per the module. And it's the easiest way for characters to go, well, I don't know, what you tell me what I'm supposed to do, because everything I've tried has ended up in failure so far.
right.
It's different when it's failure from the role, but if there's failure because it's different to what you have planned, that's when you have your characters get that disconnect.
I think there's a couple of things that we've raised on Facebook with the mic stand and some of the stuff that I've done as well. When it comes to situations like that, when to roll and when not to roll.
Yes.
And that, I think, is important when you're designing an encounter, because if you need the PCs to go back to what Caitlin just said, if you need the PCs to find a key, don't make them roll for it.
Yeah.
Just say, okay, what do you do? Do you search the room? Yes, we search the room. Okay, so you search the room for how long are you spending?
Yeah.
And, you just roll with it.
Yeah.
And just say, okay, so behind, you're moving along and you find one of the paintings or whatever else, and you look behind the painting and there it is. Because you want them to go down that path.
I mean, also, you can describe the scene, and if they say, I want to look behind the painting, they don't have to roll a perception check. They can just do that.
Exactly right.
One of the things when I very first started GMing and giving it a go, my partner Chase in the States, he gave a really good example about how to involve characters without them even really being aware that they were doing it. In exactly what you guys were just talking about, is that when they would go into the room, he would reward characters who actually went above and beyond in terms of describing what they were doing.
Yep.
So he might have had in his head the keys behind the picture.
Yep.
But if a character came in and goes, okay, I'm going to go and have a look at, the different types of, heat that is on the ground and try and find something, and they described a really cool way about how they were searching for it. in maybe somewhere completely different to what he had, well, that's where that key is going to be because they looked at it in a different way. So reward your players as well.
Yeah, reward them for their initiative and keep flexible. There should always be multiple solutions to any one problem that you present to the players.
I think it goes back down to what we talked about last episode when looking at the actual adventure, that you don't tie it to a place.
Yeah.
And the same sort of thing or the same rule applies to stuff that you want the PCs to find.
Yeah.
You just know that that key is in that room. In your mind, it might be behind the picture, but PCs might say, okay, well, I searched the desk to find whatever else, and you find that key because that's all that you're trying to get out. Don't tie it to a specific location within that room.
Well, and not just what you want them to find. So say they need to get into the safe, right? As you say. They could find the key, which is obviously one solution to that problem. Or one of the players gets creative and goes, you know what? I've got a really big drill here.
Or, I have a really big gun.
Or I've got magic. I'm just going to teleport what's in the safe out here.
Wow. Yes.
There you go.
True.
I think as well, when you're looking at combat, it doesn't always we're looking
Conflict.
at encounters, but when we're looking at encounters and we're looking at specifically combat, there's lots of different ways combat can be done. It doesn't always have to be, okay, you've come across these people and they're looking really aggressive at you, roll for initiative. I mean, that can be, but combat could be a variety of different things. You could have ambushes, you could have duels, you could have skirmishes, you could have mass combat, like if you're playing in, huge big warfares, whether it's up in space or it's down on the ground in horses with trebuchets. But you could also even have tournaments. Your characters can be involved in a variety of different things. So tournaments, from what we were talking about before, is jousting or being in the ring or being, in the underworld and you have to try and fight your way up for the title, or being in mechs and fighting in the boxing ring and mechs kind of things. There's lots of different ways that combat can take place and can also happen through narrative story that you might not even be prepared for.
And if you're setting up a campaign, look at your players and see what the type of players they are. If the players you're playing with aren't the type of players who generally like to get into combats every single 2 seconds, don't necessarily make combat the focus. Because it can be easy to just go, let's put a combat in here all the time. Look at other ways you can spice up. Even if it is a combat, look at different ways you can make it a more interesting combat encounter.
Yeah.
There's loads of things you can do.
Well, the other thing is you could put a combat in the in the scene. The players approach it and they see that these guys are ready to fight. And they go, we're just going to walk around that and sneak past that entire...
Yeah, absolutely.
But in saying that, I want to talk to the players really quickly here. When you're watching a TV show, right, and you see an obvious cool scene coming up, like a showdown, for example, what would be more interesting to watch? The cowboys enter the showdown, or the cowboys, sneak away and avoid the fight?
Yeah.
You as the players have a responsibility too, to look at the scene and go, well, what is interesting here? We could manipulate this to our advantage to bypass the combat, but all you're doing then is making what should be a cool scene boring for yourself.
Yeah.
So don't try and force avoiding a combat if you think, I know it's sort of opposing what we were saying before, but address it like it's a TV show. If it's interesting to see on camera, let it happen. Don't try and always be clever and force it not to happen. Because
That's right.
a lot of players that I've run into in the past do that. Purely to be that opposite sort of nature.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, if you wouldn't, having the GM try and force something on the players would be just as the same as the players trying to force it on the GM. But what you're kind of saying before made me think of the rule of cool. When we're talking about, enforcing the rules of the game, you always go for, well, what would be cooler first? And I think that goes in really well with how counter should be done. Rule of cool should reign supreme in all RPGs.
This is ultimately a cooperative storytelling experience.
Agreed.
You say that until everything that you had planned goes out the window when the PCs take hold.
And the table gets flipped.
The other thing to take into consideration as well, and this just kind of goes back to, again, what Mike has said in one of his articles about the whole roll versus not roll. And what was the other one that you did that is, it talks about like the one roll combat encounters and things like that?
I swear I wrote it. Incidental encounters.
Yeah, incidental encounters. So you've got a situation that you don't necessarily want to do an entire combat, but you want to give that combat feel. So using a system like that is another way that you can structure an encounter that doesn't necessarily need to go into a full-length combat ordeal that can sometimes go on for an extended period of time, because it doesn't matter what game you're playing, combat does take a fairly long time to progress through. Sometimes it's fun, but sometimes you just don't want to necessarily have to go through the constant, backwards and forwards through rounds and whatever else. That can be fun depending on what the encounter is, and it's certainly something that I like to do with new players, is because it gets them used to the system and gets them used to thinking about how they can use their skills in a different way rather than just rely on your shoot 'em up or your bash 'em up skills. But if you've got PCs that go, I want to work around this, there's still an exciting way that you can do that through that system.
Absolutely.
And also you can use skill challenges as well. So
we're blessed with this setting because there's so many options and so many ways you can tackle things. Either that's through ways presented to in the book in an official sense, or through other ways that players have sort of brought up in their own sort of house rule sort of ways, or just, as you as a group sort of find ways to resolve things. Incidental combats is one thing. Incidental encounters is one thing. Even like incorporating combats, I use that,
Yes, I was about to say you did a hand
comments.
gesture for a podcast.
Yeah, exactly. For example, you're sneaking past a sentry and you want to break that sentry's neck.
You mean you're sneaking past a fortnight?
Yes, sneaking past a fortnight. But instead of, if the GM wants to keep the game going, you could have, the GM could say to his player, make me a stealth check. If you get 2 or 3 advantages, you break that sentry's neck as you sneak on by. Because we have an awesome narrative dice system here, which allows you to be super fluid with the rules in a very more abstract sort of nature. So when you want to, do that one cool scene of one dice roll, you certainly can. There's heaps you can do.
Look, one of the things that when we start talking about encounters as well, that, if we want to go down to the absolute fine minutiae of it as well, is something that GM Chris said to me while I was overseas, is that always when it comes to any sort of encounter or a skill check or whatever else, if a PC wants to do multiple things, only ever cause them to roll once during their turn.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because it's something that it's easy to get into the habit of, especially if you're coming from
D&D.
Exactly. Not that we sort of, cast aspersions on D&D, but, it is something that we need to be aware of, that the system works differently, that it's not, okay, so I want to tumble across the roadway to get to the monster. Right, make an athletics roll or make an acrobatics check. And if that fails, well, your turn ends.
Which pretty much happened to me every time I tried to do something. I would have this huge, big thing in my mind of what I was going to do, and I did my typical Caitlin roll, and my character turned less into a awesome heroic character and more into what I'm like in reality, which is falling on his or her face repeatedly.
But instead, what you do is you basically just give a setback die, or if it's something, very narrative, the GM might say, "Oh, look, have a boost die for that as well."
And
so
that also comes down to that thing of you were saying before of knowing when to ask for a roll, not when to ask for a roll.
Yep.
That player narrative describing how they're getting across the street doesn't really matter.
So
How they get from point A to point B, unless there's something drastic, like there's a running stream in between the two of them or something like that.
Yep.
Different story. But if it's just a dirt path, there's no difference from walking across the street to stab a guy in the back to doing a backflip across the street to stabbing a guy in the back, because ultimately it's the same effect. However, if the player's very cool and descriptive, as you just said, give them a boost dice. You start giving those boost dice out to players who are being cool and descriptive with the narrative. Then they're going to start doing that more and more often because they're realizing the GM's being very generous with that boost dice.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
And then watch them describe everything they do.
Yeah.
Look, and I know that I've said this in the past, but it is kind of like, and this is going to sound terrible, but it is kind of like teaching a pet, that effectively see. I knew if everybody could see the looks from the players.
Use Pavlov's bell instead.
But effectively,
Sorry, what? Is there food available? I suddenly got hungry.
Someone opens some tuna.
But what it is that if you're teaching anybody anything, if you give them some sort of a recognition of, a good deed, that is then going to play out through everybody at the table because that's then only going to add flavour to the game that you're running.
I think as well, when, the more and more we talk about this, because we started talking about, designing your encounters, and we started off with our episodic sheet, and in order to get to, okay, well, what's that going to be made up of, we start looking at the type of encounters you're looking at and how that could work. And I know for me, in just hearing this conversation, I start to even go, and I know I'm super, super new when it comes to GMing in this world, just in comparison, but you almost kind of get this feeling of, oh my gosh, I have to plan for every possibility of encounter within each of those areas because you don't know. And it doesn't have to be as hard as that. You don't have to look at the sheet that you have prepared and go, okay, this is going to be the investigation stage. So I need to be prepared for a combat encounter. I need to be prepared in case they want a social checkout. That I need to be prepared in case for some reason they're going to start hacking or they're going to do. You don't need to have multiple encounters planned before you sit at that table because you actually don't know what your players are going to do. Yep. And there's lots of different ways that you can actually be prepared by not having things identified to a location, by not having your NPCs, unless they're vital NPCs, completely statted out.
Yep.
Or even just having them as you have multiple NPCs that have the same stats that you just give them the different names. Like in one of our other episodes, GM Huz was talking about how he has the different character names that are just listed out, and he's just spent,
random names.
Yeah, you just spent 10 minutes before the session writing out names so that when someone goes, oh, an NPC walks in, you're like, yes, that is Archibald, and it sounds like you knew him all along, but it doesn't. But you can have these, and there's
Just
so
as
many
planned.
tools out there. There's heaps of tools. There's lots of little NPC cards that you can find that have all that there that you can just have at the side. And if it goes into a social, you have the stats there. If it goes into a combat, you have it there, and you just pick and pull. It doesn't need to be super planned. Your adversaries, when they're going to come in at what point and all that kind of stuff. Or none. It can be easy.
There's a few little easy prep things that you can do that means that when you're in the game, it just makes it smooth. Having a couple of stat blocks handy, a couple of names of places.
Off you go. So just following on from what GM Caitlin was saying about being prepared for almost any sort of contingency. I suppose that
making it easy on yourself.
Exactly. I find a bit of a hump it took me many years to get over GMing before I came along with the narrative system, and probably even into the narrative system, was I felt for every single encounter I had to sit down and plan it out. Everything, including the map, how many monsters would be in the fight, and etc. And I think that's a common holdover from D&D and other similar systems where you have to scale the fights. Otherwise, the fights quickly end your enjoyment as a GM or your players' enjoyment if you don't scale it perfectly.
Or you also just want to have everything planned and ready for any possible eventuality, so you overplan yourself and overcommit yourself to stuff because you're too scared to be on the
That's
fly.
right. Honestly, what I've found, which helps, it's going to sound strange for me saying it, is I don't plan any encounters. I will give myself a broad strokes of what the story's going to be using, essentially GM Hooley's
Episodic adventure chart.
Adventures. I can never remember the name. Episodic adventure chart, because I write it all down, what's going to happen in broad strokes. And in between writing it and time to actually start playing it, it's going over and over and over in my brain. And I'm starting to put contingency plans down for every situation that may come up. And by the time we actually sit down at the table, the encounter's already written in my head. It's good to go. And I can adapt that encounter because nothing is set in stone on paper, and I don't feel attached to anything or tied to anything. So I'm more willing to adapt and change. Because I know I've found in my brain that I've already got myself prepared to change things on the fly and how to handle this if this goes this way, and etc. I know that may be a bit of an advanced technique, but trying into the habit of not necessarily writing everything down like it's the gospel. Try and be more free flowing with it. Have an idea what you want to do, but don't feel like you have to follow it to a T.
I think the key would be to, when you're writing out your your elements of each of your beats is to have a good idea as to if the world was a perfect place, what you would play it out as,
Or what would be cool?
or what would be cool. Because you'll obviously know your players very well by that stage. If you're not running a
Well, fingers crossed, you know your players very well. You
that's
never
true.
know. You could have a one-shot table full of people you don't know, so you might have to throw in a whole bunch of random things to try and see what they're like.
That's right. So what I think is a really good idea, as a sort of, and it's actually mentioned in the book as a general thing, is that no matter what your encounter is, whether it be combat or whatever, find out what the people who are in that encounter, what's their strength. So if it's in your mind that it's a combat encounter, know that most people will have a 3 in an agility, and they might have 1 or 2 depending on how powerful you see your PCs being. But if they're a really good combatter, they might have 3 yellows. They might have if they're a mediocre, they might have 2, and if they're just sort of a general person that they would have some sort of training like a city guard, they may only have 1 yellow. And then what you do is then everything else is just 2s. So if the PCs decide to go and run it as a social encounter, have them just as 2s. That's it. So you don't have to think too far. You don't have to stat them out or whatever else. You just basically make that more... it's just easier on yourself, I think, to do it that way. As far as like stats, without actually going to, setting out every single stat and every single creature.
You don't need a stat block for everything.
Yeah.
No.
You just need a couple of numbers.
Yeah, so when you're doing your beat, you basically just say the main person will have range light, and that would be their main stat. And you might say agility 3, range light 2. And that's all that you put in, because the rest of it you just automatically know is going to be 2s.
Yep.
And I think as well, one of the things that GM Huz has spoken about before in terms of when we're talking about statting things out, or if you're wanting to try and make things more difficult for your characters, there's nothing to say that you can't have multiples of the one thing in order to increase its difficulty. So particularly when we're talking about minion groups, there's nothing to say that if they've managed to completely decimate a minion group, that another one doesn't just come on by and happens to bring some friends with an adversary that you've already had planned.
Yeah.
So or if it's going to be a social encounter, there's other different things you could just add more of and have multiples of, or there's other elements at play that you might not necessarily know about. So maybe someone needs to do a different kind of check in order to get that information versus just charm or coercion or negotiation. There could be a knowledge check that they have to try and do. There's lots of different ways that you can increase difficulty, make it different without, having to have all of this huge big manual of gospel that you've just created to try and to tell that story.
You don't need more monsters to make the combat more challenging or interesting or difficult. You can add lots of things, as GM Caitlin was just saying, that can make it very cool without necessarily just throwing more goons at your enemies. And that applies to any encounter.
And the other thing to take into consideration as well is definitely reskinning is your friend.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't matter. The town guard is going to be the same as the...
Fortnite?
You keep going back to that.
Oh, the ye olde fortnight. We must encounter him.
If anyone skipped the first part of this episode, they probably think that I don't know what a fortnight is.
Look, it just reminds me of the old ancient seal,
Right. Okay.
It's ancient, so it's more venerable.
So, but anyway, going back to what I was saying. So what you've got is that your town guard is going to be no different than your mercenary. That is going to be no different to, or there might be some differences, but you can make those changes on the fly.
Yeah, they could be narrative just as much as they could be stats.
That's right. So, that it's not as though that the stats are going to be any different to a town guard from one city to the next. They're still generally going to be the same.
Well, speaking of skinning, you had in our Knight's Edge adventure, the creatures in the storm were just Gruffins.
Oh, well, just Gruffins. Yes.
Groffensbrock.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't need to be sort of, it goes down to how the GM describes something. Because ultimately, and this is something which I think is key when it comes to encounters, is that the PCs don't see the stats.
That's right.
Nope.
You know,
Unless you show them.
unless you show them.
Don't do
But
that.
You don't need to, because that takes away the mystery. But yeah, you don't need to, and it just goes down to how you describe it. And there can be elements that you can just tack onto the fly because that suits the description more than anything else.
Which would be a really good example of what you did with our Darth Vader campaign, our Dragon Squadron campaign when we encountered Darth Vader.
Yep.
So you had the stats for Darth Vader that came out, and you added extra bits to it because narratively that made sense for that time, as not to mention we were also very high XP characters.
But it's true. You can modify things on the fly. And you can take away stuff if it doesn't make sense in that particular scene to have, if you were attacking or were in a combat encounter with, say, a bunch of thugs, you can still use the stats from a militia, but instead of having melee, they may have brawl instead. And so you just flip those sort of skills onto the side. And the PCs aren't going to know any different.
I know a very common one that I think we all do, well, GMs of Star Wars have done in the past, is the adversary bounty hunter stat block. It comes with a, what's the weapon?
Disruptor.
Disruptor rifle. And it's like, holy, I don't want
PCs to have a disruptor.
No, well, that too. And also I don't want them to melt the PCs in one shot. So number of times I've gone, well, this one doesn't have that disruptor rifle. And I just give him a regular blaster rifle. And no one knows any different.
That's right.
That's right. So, yeah.
So we've spoken a lot about combat encounters because I think combat is probably the easiest to talk about when it comes to encounters. I'd be keen to start talking about some of the other encounters that are available, like hacking or...
Well, I did want to mention something, talking about the skinning, which sort of, like say you're wanting to do a social encounter, and your players, get offended by something that your opponent NPC says and shoots them in the face. Suddenly you've got, and that they were an important plot NPC because you haven't really thought about where to go from here. This is a complete curveball.
Yeah.
There are many ways to move to the next scene.
Yeah.
And you can reuse the stats that you had for this person. For example, say he was a merchant and you were talking to him. He was going to set the players up with a whole, shipping contract or something. They've shot him. They of course search his body.
Tend to do.
Yeah. They search his body because they're gonna they're gonna Greyhawk the body. And they find something in there that leads them to his warehouse, and they're met by someone else while they're trying to ransack this place, who then offers them a job.
And who's got exactly the same stats. Yeah, so there's
They
nothing
don't know the
wrong
difference.
No, that's right. And it goes down to the PCs don't know what you've got behind the screen.
Exactly.
If you're using a screen.
The name, you pick that off your list, and away
That's right.
you go.
The names have been changed to protect the innocent. Or the guilty, depending on how you're looking at it.
Or the dead.
Or the dead. So, yeah, there are certainly key sort of things that you can do to make your life easier.
Yeah.
And I think reskinning is probably one of the higher ones.
Get onto it.
But that's also an example of a social encounter gone wrong.
Agreed. So,
All right, depending on how you look at it. Probably from the PC perspective.
Very
that went
right.
very right.
It was
We
lucrative.
went wrong for that merchant.
We got this cool job out of shooting this guy in the face.
But it's that sentiment of there's always a bigger fish. There's just because one's dead doesn't mean there's not another one right around the corner.
that is true.
So as GM Caitlin was saying before, other encounters. Because your combat is common.
So, what's some of our other encounters that we can have?
I'd be keen to talk about hacking.
Sure.
Yes.
So hacking rules are in the optional rules in the back of the Genesys core rulebook. No doubt that they will be presented in some way, shape or form in the Netrunner book when it is released, whenever that might be. So hacking rules are on page 232 of the core rulebook for those who are following on at home.
Well, hacking. Hacking, I think, is one of those things a lot of players will. Well, obviously, it doesn't work in every setting. We're in a magic setting. We're doing. Well, you could be hacking things. Orcs and goblins usually.
Yeah, hacking and slashing typically.
That's true.
Yes.
But in any sci-fi, even modern setting, hacking probably will come up. And hacking is one of those things you can just hand wave and have a simple computer's check to resolve.
Yep.
However, if you really get into the crunch of hacking, go through and read the rules, it's actually quite a solid system. And you can do some pretty cool things with it. You can have your PC group, your party, running around in the middle of a combat. Mm-hmm. They're shooting things, blowing things up as waves and waves of enemies are throwing themselves at the PC's location, whilst the party's slicer or hacker of the group is trying to get through the door of the starship's bridge to turn the ship from the sun that's approaching, and it has to hack through the system. So your PCs will have two encounters going at once. Combat encounter in this example, and your hacking encounter. And both systems, using the beauty of Genesys, work seamlessly with each other. Because everything you do in a hacking situation is maneuvers and actions just like a combat.
Yep.
So when it's the hacker's turn to do things, you, as the GM, just make him do his own little separate combat versus either the system or the system's defender or opposition if someone happens
Which can
to
have
get you.
their own slot in the initiative as well.
Exactly.
This is the whole thing, and I was just about to mention that the way that the initiative slots work
Yep.
allows that so well, in my
Fluidly.
opinion, and because it just works in. Okay, so you're next, rather than running it. And I guess this would be a key thing when running encounters. Don't do them as two separate encounters when you're running a hacking. If you've got the main PCs who are doing, their run, to put it in Shadowrun terms, and then you've got the hacking PC. Don't do them as two separate encounters.
Don't separate them. Think about how rewarding it will be if at the very last, he knows it's going to be the last roll to open that door so that his friends can escape from this room where they've been fighting the stormtroopers or what have you. And he selects to go at the beginning of the initiative order, cracks the door, it opens up, and he saves his friends.
Exactly.
Or even putting it in terms of movie terms, Jurassic Park.
Yep.
They're fighting velociraptors coming everywhere, and she's having to go through the system. Like, I know this system, going through, weaving through, and that's all done narratively. So while the people are trying to fend off the velociraptors in one initiative slot, and the velociraptors are trying to hack and slash in another initiative slot, and then she's trying to weave through the system and going through all the different portals on that to try and find the one little node that she's looking for in order to unlock all the doors and to connect everything. That's another initiative slot.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And when constructing a hacking encounter for your adventure, try not to make it dry, because I think hacking could be one of those things that becomes very dry very quickly.
Yep.
Spice it up. Then incorporate what's going on outside the computer hack with what's going on with the computer hack. For example, the hack is trying to get through the door. The PCs who have the guns are shooting off and holding off against the waves of stormtroopers. All of a sudden, one of the PCs rolls a despair. And he's thrown a grenade. He's tossed it wide. It's bounced off the ground and hit the main power conduit that runs along the wall. Explodes, and the hacker is now out of the system. And he has to try and reestablish connection. All of a sudden, the party's mechanic has a new job for this encounter. His job is to go fix that power conduit to get the hacker back online, because the hacker can't do anything until the power's reestablished.
And it's also really cool to look at how you describe the hacking. Like, the hacking can be done in a variety of different ways. It doesn't always have to be, I'm going to try and access a system. I'm going to try and do this. It could be, you could look at hacking in a variety of different ways based on the setting and based on the world that you've created. Like, I could think of Matrix. Your hacking could be that you are looking and you have to go through the code as you're trying to do that while you're an actual physical embodiment within the Matrix itself. Or you could just be sitting on an extremely old computer trying to find the little file path that you're trying to do of C-DOS. It can be described in so many different ways and using the same skills.
It depends on your setting, like how you can make it really campy, like the old 90s movie Hackers, where the actual,
Hacker Man.
Well, the actual process of hacking is like this extra, like as similar to the Matrix, is this really odd, tangible world which doesn't really exist in hacking at all.
Don't try and make it realistic.
No, but you can really use that sense of escapism and make hacking this really flamboyant, cool thing. And do some crazy things. Netrunner is a perfect example of it. You get any of the ICE cards for Netrunner, and none of them are just boring walls of text. They all have this cool artwork which portrays, this ice and these ice breakers as cool monsters and fortresses and tanks and vehicles and that sort of thing because it exists on another digital realm.
This is one of the other things I'd like to mention, because we've been talking about doing a hacking encounter, during a combat encounter and all of this thing. I would personally say don't isolate hacking.
No.
Don't try and run it by itself because it ends up splitting the party. And that's nothing that you want to do. You don't want to have your hacker spending half the session trying to get into one system while the rest of the party sits around doing nothing. This is one thing that I would recommend is always spliced with something else.
And it doesn't have to be a combat encounter. Imagine a social encounter. The PCs are, infiltrating this ballroom party, trying to get information from someone, whilst a hacker's snuck into the back room. He's downloading bits and pieces from the data servers.
I like the idea that he's downloading stuff from the servers and then feeding it to the other PCs through an earpiece.
Couple of things come to mind. There would be any episode of Alias, and any of the Mission Impossible movies.
Yes,
because there is a hacker which is always playing a part, but they're still part of that, and it just go backwards and forwards in the scenes we're seeing on film because, as you said, somebody comes up to talk to somebody else and they're going, who is this person? And like the hacker sort of looks up all information and then feeds that information to them. So that sort of thing, I think, works really, really well. So I would agree with you that you don't have that hacking encounter as a separate thing. However, when it comes to if they want to do hacking before they get to that point, let them, but simplify it. So that it doesn't bog down the system.
It's a computer check or something, or you roll it into a skill check to find information, a skill challenge to roll it into finding information before the event.
Yeah. Hacking's one of those things you can either make it really quick and make it one check, but if you want to make it a cool, spotlight scene for you, the hacker, or for the hacker and the rest of the party, then you can get really deep with it.
Yeah. So running a hacking encounter is one thing, but let's talk quickly about how to design a hacking encounter without getting into the minutiae of it again. So what I think is that you need to look at how hard is it going to be for the PC to be doing that particular thing. And I think the easiest way to do that is just to go, right, is this going to be, use your words. And I think this goes down to any sort of encounter when it comes to working out the difficulty of something. If you sort of say, well, that's going to be pretty average. Well, there you go. Use these difficulties have names so that you can sort of associate with how hard something is going to be. So if you think that, this is going to be pretty hard, well, there you go. That's your difficulty. It's just go and just use your language to base your difficulty on.
And seeing the hacking rules as well, focusing on themselves, they have heaps of so they give heaps of examples of difficulty values and whatnot to use. So if they're doing a particular task, that's already set there for you. So there's actually not a whole lot of work involved. It's all in black and white in front of you already, which is handy.
Yeah.
And if you're wanting to make things, if they're trying to do something really crazy, there's no harm in actually putting in an opponent that they have to try and get across anyway. Trying to hack into a computer system that they have no business in going into. They might have other people that are trying actively to prevent that. So it's, as we were talking before, hacking, they're all different kinds of, adversarial type of encounters. So that could be something there as well. Yeah. Or even if it's not like a combat of a hacker against a hacker and it just happens to be, in virtual world, it could also be a social encounter. I know, for an example, is our Stars Without Number campaign. When our computer player, when he gets into the system to chat with his AI type of character and do that, he is actually connected through wires and cables, but how it's described narratively and how it's undertaken, it's a social encounter, and it's a social event between the GM, even though it's all theoretically taking place in code. So there's lots of different ways that you can look at these types of encounters based on the characters that you had before. So as you mentioned, look at the players that you have, how they want to play it, and then design those encounters around that based on where they are and their difficulty for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about hacking encounters. So generally speaking, the rules...
Very briefly talked about hacking encounters.
That's an entire topic again, and I think that we will wait probably for the Netrunner book whenever that decides to come about before we really go
Fingers
tackle
crossed.
that. Fingers crossed.
I keep on wanting to go,
soon.
here's how you can do this and all the different design elements within that. But yeah, we do. Otherwise, we'll get too bogged down.
That's right. So let's talk about when we look back at our last episode, when we start talking about episodic adventure design. One of the things that is mentioned in there is development. So we've obviously got our cliffhangers, which is a lot of the time it's combat, but it can be something where there is, that there is a cost involved, whatever that might be. It might be financial, it might be wounds, it might be property that you're owning, etc., etc. But there's normally a cost involved. And when it comes to the development stuff, the PCs are learning, the PCs are interacting with other NPCs. So that's where you basically get your exploration and investigative encounters. So how do we go about designing those sorts of things? Caitlin?
Well, when we're talking about, the episodic, you're looking at what needs to happen and what the characters need to know for the next part of the adventure. So do they need to find a place? Do they need to find a item? Do they need to find a person? So once you know what they actually need to have in order to successfully get to the next part or, cross that gate to the next one, kind of gives you a good idea about what type of investigation you need to kind of set up and allow to have room for the players to engage with. So if you're looking for a particular type of person, then they're probably going to be looking at different types of other people to talk to, or the computers that they need to try and find to do all that kind of stuff. And it kind of shapes the way that you need to design that encounter. If it's an item, it changes that as well. But in saying that, we're also talking about that in a very general sense as well, whereas we're not being too prescriptive in setting a location for that. So if you have an idea about what it is they need to find, then you just need to think of all the different ways that they could potentially try and actually identify that in order to get to the next stage. So I think that would be the first step in how to design that, because then that'll factor into everything else.
True.
I think exploration and investigation encounters, they're a lot more broad than the rest of the encounters so far, because you could easily have many social encounters and many hacking, even combat encounters, all within the one investigation encounter.
Yeah.
Depending on how the PCs handle
exactly.
it. Yeah.
Like if you're going back to the ballroom, for example, you could have, as a part of the investigation, tracking down the corrupt politician, the players have infiltrated this diplomatic ballroom party. And you have one player hacking. You have one player who's set up somewhere sniping or ready to counter snipe. The other few PCs running around in a social encounter on the actual ballroom floor. That all falls under the investigation encounter. So it's interesting. Investigation is certainly a much broader umbrella.
It's a bit of a hybrid encounter, isn't it?
It really is, yeah.
It is. But I think probably the best way that we've come up with, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the best way is skill challenges.
Yes.
That they fit in nicely, and you can do multiple things, and PCs can use multiple skills to deal with that. To deal with that encounter, it's of great benefit. Yeah.
Every time that we've done a skill challenge for an exploration type of encounter, it always visualizes in my mind kind of like a montage.
Yeah.
So right before a big con is going to happen, all the characters are doing their little bit to get ready, and like narratively it's described. It just feels a lot like that as well.
I think it's this is where skill challenges really fit into the game, I feel. Because often when we do skill challenges in this sort of a setting for an exploration or an investigation, I know with my characters, I end up using skills that I don't normally use.
No.
And it's a good way to shine in that regard.
It's also, skill challenge is a great way of resolving, especially when you're on a time crunch, when you want to get a lot of stuff done in a session. Like, you can do an entire investigation in half an hour or even less. However, you can spend entire sessions investigating, using the other encounters, social, etc. I know in the past when I run Dark Heresy campaigns, we've spent, my party has spent, 2 or 3 months of gameplay in the underworld of a hive searching down this criminal. And that was an entire session, the entire campaign arc, which involved social, it involved combat, it involved everything under the sun, and it all came down under the umbrella of an investigation.
And I think this is where you're really talking about what the highlight of your campaign is, where the focus is. Because with Dark Heresy,
that's the focus.
That's the focus of the entire game.
Exactly. That's right.
And so, we want to do a montage for a game that is more focused on the social and combat. Yeah. Whereas with this, it's a
perfect example how you can approach it in two different ways.
Exactly.
Both work perfectly fine. There's no right or wrong answer.
Yep.
It's the focus of your campaign. If you're playing a very gun-heavy game, you don't want to spend 90% of your time investigating. You want the players to get that over and done with, find the next clue, and push the story forwards.
Mm-hmm. And there's also different ways of looking at investigation and exploration type of encounters that subvert from the very stereotypical of I go to the local tavern and talk to someone because they all have all the goss, or cantina or bar or club or wherever it is you're setting is the most appropriate place where all that social hub happens. Because I know it's always like, I've got to find a person. Let's go to the tavern. There'll be someone rumoring about some there, which there's different ways that you could look at it by having that freedom and having that planned.
Absolutely.
And again, I'm using hand gestures for a podcast. That doesn't work.
When will we learn?
I don't know. We're not. How many episodes are we in now and we still have the worst habits?
Also, another thing with investigations in your campaign, I feel that everything you do in a game, you can get away with never rolling a dice roll in an investigation. If your players are picking up all the clues you're putting down, they're following it all in character, they're doing everything right, don't make unnecessary rolls. If the players have worked the clue out, move them along to the next scene. If, I know when I was running the Dark Heresy one, there was no real actual checks involved to have them find clues. They just followed the breadcrumbs, and they did it in a very smart manner. And if the players are doing that well, don't force checks. Don't make them make rolls.
So what you're saying is that you really need to know when to roll them, when to hold them, when to walk away.
But I think investigation, out of all the encounters that is in Genesys and every RPG out there, you don't need to roll. It's not. You don't have to force rolls. Let it evolve naturally. And if your players are finding the clues, cool. Then they're doing something right, and you're doing something right as a GM.
That's right. Exactly. So we've talked about combat encounters, we've talked about hacking encounters, exploration and investigative encounters, and we've kind of talked a little bit about social encounters, but let's look under the hood with social encounters a little bit more. Do they really operate any differently than other than the mechanical sense, do they operate any differently than a combat encounter? I would like to suggest they don't.
Not in a major sense. Like for what we're talking here is an overview sort of sense. No, because you just have your stat block and you can interact with them. You don't even necessarily need to roll dice. But if it does come down to it, you need to know what you're working with.
Because one of the things that I've noticed just, in years of gaming is that if you've got the GM is talking to a PC and the conversation is flowing and it doesn't need not everybody who plays a role-playing game, let's face it, can be, there are still people who are a little bit socially awkward.
Not every player has charisma 18 like their character.
So you've got a case that the interaction is going along smoothly. Do you really even need to roll? I would like to suggest you don't.
No. I think social encounters is one of those things like similar to investigations. If it's going smoothly, it's going well, things are being role played perfectly, don't make rolls.
Yeah. So when you're designing a social encounter, it's going to be a case that...
Well, sorry to interrupt you on that point, but when would be a good time to know when you should roll in a social encounter?
It's a tough one.
One thing that I would mention as well on that is sometimes players, because you can have problem players at the table as well, and especially with people that are very charismatic, they can try and use that charisma to steamroll over NPCs without actually having to roll dice.
That is true.
Which does not represent their character in any way.
Exactly.
No,
they're playing Dirg, the gun thug, who's suddenly the most charming dude in the world.
Exactly.
The guy controlling him is the most charming dude in the world.
So that might be a good point to roll dice.
That is true. Yeah, exactly. So, and in a circumstance like that, you might be going, okay, we'll have a couple of boost die or something like that. But I think that designing a social encounter, you really need to just be, again, looking at their primary stat. Yes. So presence or cunning or whatever it is, what sort of person you're talking about or, that is being dealt with. And then their primary skill. And then if anything else happens, well, it's just a 2. Same sort of thing.
But going to what GM Caitlin just said of knowing when to roll and not to roll, I think when not to roll and when to roll is things when there's been deceptions had and maybe even coercions being had. Charm or negotiation or whatever you want to call it, I think that is situational. If the circumstances are, both character and NPC and PC are mutually charming to one another for mutual gains, don't worry about rolls. But if you're trying to gather information, pry information,
Exactly.
leverage someone, then yes, that is essentially a social encounter where dice rolls will be required.
If you want to break it down into one word, conflict. When you as the storyteller or your NPC and your player comes into conflict in that social encounter, or their goals conflict, that's it. That's when you roll.
I think as well, it's also looking at when the decision point is within a conversation. So it's super easy as a character when you look at your character sheet to see all these yellows in your charm or whatever, to say, well, I'm going to go up to the admiral and say, turn this army around, and you know that you're probably going to succeed in a check, right? Depending on, obviously difficulty. But based on your level of that, you know that you could probably end that whole encounter in one roll just because you know you're very charming and you've got that presence. But I think as a GM, and when you're designing these social encounters, there should be a element of back and forth and conversation, and all conversations have different elements that make up that conversation.
Yeah.
There's your introduction, there's who you are, what you're doing, there's why you're doing it, and it's also feeds into that investigation stage of that. So you could have that in a variety of different ways, and it can be broken down in different ways. But I think when you get to that decision point on this is either going to be a win or a failure, that's a really good point to actually look at making a check as well.
Yeah.
Because there could be a whole section in there where you say you're negotiating or you are wanting to try and convince them of something. There could be a really awesome, amazing moment of role play and back and forth between the GM and the player about why you should do what I'm telling you to do, or why, you should think the way that I think, between either from the GM's perspective or the NPC's perspective and the PC perspective. And then when it comes to I'm ready to make a check on if I convince this person or not, that's the point where you can actually make that roll. And it's that decision point, that conflict point.
Exactly.
Yep.
Has that moment, and that makes a really cool scene.
There's also a sneaky little thing which I've started doing in a few of the online games I've played, using in other game systems, but it's all relevant. Social, no matter what system you're in. Because we've all been in that situation where we've described all our characters, we've role-played our characters having a conversation, we say it perfectly, the odds are on our favourite, roll the dice, and it just goes, it does nothing.
I don't know what you're talking about because that has never happened to me.
Exactly. But it feels like it's just neutered everything you've just said.
Exactly.
So this is what I've been doing lately is probably requires a group of fairly experienced players and a GM, but you don't say what you want to say until you roll the check. You roll the check, so you obviously outline what you're trying to get out of the check, but you don't save the narrative role-playing aspect, what your character actually says, until you've seen the result. Then you let the conversation unfold between you and the GM, depending on how the dice have already set it up. So if you roll the dice already and it's a critical failure, you can have that conversation, the back and forwards with your GM, and let you and GM have to you and the GM role play out that conversation going poorly. And it adds so much more depth and attachment to the role play immediately because, you know what the outcome of the dice result's going to be, but you have fun role playing that argument.
I love this idea as well because it means that we've talked previously about hanging entire plot points on a dice roll. This sort of allows you to avoid that because you know how the conversation's going to go and you know it's going to fail. You as a storyteller can go, well, okay, you got an advantage there. So he doesn't give you the information you need, but he tells you about someone that might know.
And you can role play this entire conversation. Obviously, if you're at a table where you don't necessarily role play word for word or in a social encounter, this isn't necessary. But if you're a group who likes to really role play it and really get behind the acting of it, you can. Perfect example was I was playing The Sprawl. It was one of Josh Bruce's online games, and my character needed to get in touch for contact and I had to make a social check. I succeeded on the social check, but there was some
Threat.
It wasn't threat because it's a different game system, but very similar aspect. It was a success with some setback. It was things weren't going perfectly. But our two characters, because we're playing this on Discord, I said to Josh, let's have fun, both our characters, my character and his NPC, had an entire conversation via text message. So I was actually typing on my PC
I like it.
and sending it to Josh, and we let the whole conversation, because we already seen the outcome of the check, we knew what the result was going to be.
Yeah.
We let this whole exchange between this PC and NPC unfold as a live text messaging scene. It was really, really cool because the whole conversation just started off with this really sort of like nasty tone, and it got worse and worse in my character's favour, and I completely manipulated this dude. However, there were strings attached to the bargain we struck.
Yeah, and you can incorporate that into the narrative so much
It was.
better.
And all the players that were watching it were having a great time because they were laughing and carrying on because they get to see this disaster or this train wreck unfold, and it was really good.
Because that's something that we see a lot more in TV shows now that are sort of based in this modern setting, even movies.
Yeah.
You see it in House of Cards a lot,
Text.
where you've got text messages between people and you're following this text stream, which kind of is a really unique way, but that's certainly what you've suggested there is exactly the way that you represent that.
The text message was the way the conversation was being presented, but the fact that the real crux of it was the fact we made the check before the conversation actually took place. It was so fun doing it because we both had to sort of role play our conversation into this train wreck, essentially.
That is really sound advice, and
give it a go.
I like it.
That's very good.
I think as well, when you're looking at designing social encounters, a really, really good way if you're trying to go, well, how do I make this a bit more than I chat to a merchant or I chat to the bigwig, is to look at your characters and their backgrounds and the motivations that they've created. I know that's identified in the rule book when it talks about social encounters is playing to your character's motivations. But every single social encounter that I have had that I remember vividly in my mind is when something from my character's background or my motive or appeals to my motivation has come into play. And I think that when you're looking at creating something that's truly unique and more so than just, two characters chatting or things like that, it's a really good way of doing it. And it's also a really good way of using your threats and advantages in terms of social combat. So when we're talking in terms of social encounters, I should say, because when we talk about combat, we talk about advantages and setbacks in terms of you drop your gun, you're in cover, you're out of cover. But when we're talking about advantages and disadvantages in social encounters or boost die, setback die. It's a really good way of looking at how to appeal to the characters that are either really good at social encounters or really bad by appealing to what their motivations are, their flaws. Because if you've got a character that might not necessarily have the skills in a negotiation check or a type of social encounter, but they have this desire as part of their character in order to succeed in this, then that's valid, and they can narratively explain why this is pushing their character forward and why there's a big tie in this type of social encounter. There's a lot of boost die that could be used there, and it's not necessarily social encounters shouldn't be reserved just for the social or the face characters. There's lots of different ways that could be done. And a good way to do that is looking at your characters' backgrounds.
And so much memorable moments can occur from social combats. And I think a lot of campaign social stuff can be sort of glossed over.
Yeah.
Let it happen, because there's so much in our games we've had over the years, which some of the most memorable parts are social things, either between PCs or NPCs, because we let it unfold and cool stuff happens. And a GM can really look at a player, as you were just saying, look at a player's motivations and really apply pressure to the player and get them really challenge them at the very core. Perfect example was the Stars Without Number the other week.
Don't you mean Meetings Without Number?
Meetings Without Number. It was when we got pulled over for inspection, and the inspection officer who knew my character was really trying to target her motivations, which was her past, so character background, and the fact that she was a failed cadet and she was basically pinned as killing her whole squad, which she never did, but general knowledge is she did.
It's a touchy subject.
Exactly. But Josh knew my character's one of my character's main flaws, and that was quick to anger. And when she gets angry, she really gets angry. And Josh was really trying to apply that, and it worked fantastically.
It was amazing to see.
Yeah.
The back chatting that happened was like...
it was a good social encounter, and it wasn't necessary. Like the entire scene could have played out at that social encounter, at all. But if the things had gone particularly bad, then it could have broke out into a combat encounter.
Yeah.
That would have been bad.
For them, of course.
Four destroyers flying around us.
Wow.
For them. But another example as well, if you're looking at when you're designing these things, like this is the point an NPC comes in and all of a sudden your social character who's having this major conversation with an NPC and all of a sudden they roll a despair. But you have another NPC that's going to come up at a later stage and that's, will rattle them. It's a really good opportunity to use that in your social encounters in order to feed into stay tuned or what's going to happen next. I know a really, really good example. And again, the social encounter that sticks in my mind is when we're playing in Dragon Squadron. And my character, who was a face character, was having a chat with just, going up to try and have a chat to this boss of the underworld kind of thing. No big deal, completely cool as a cucumber, charming as her usual self, even though a little bit of a smart-assy kind of way. And I rolled a despair in my check. And then all of a sudden, my, step brother or, figurative brother who my character grew up with and had this whole backstory with, turns up in chains as a slave to the person that she's trying to have this conversation with. And she has to try and maintain her cool in not to react to this type of, oh my gosh, this is just happening. And that led into the next combat encounter, obviously, and led into it led into a vehicle encounter, which we're going to get into next, which then led into a combat encounter, and that was a really good way of linking it all together and have those character backgrounds, have that design, and also have that on the fly. Oh my gosh, I've got a despair. How am I going to use a despair in a social encounter and thinking on your feet with what you've already got?
Because if you look at, just touch base on the way that Star Wars does it, is that you can use people's motivations, you can use people's obligation, their duty, or even the morality if you're looking at Force and Destiny. But certainly in Genesys, when you're looking at whoever is going to be probably taking part, and it doesn't even need to be somebody who's taking part. It can be someone who knows something about one of the PC's weaknesses, strengths, or whatever else that can just get sort of brought up so that creates sort of that little bit of anxiety, tension, or whatever else. So I think when you're designing these encounters, keep those things in mind and just write that down so that you know exactly sort of who it is that you're going to be targeting.
Yeah.
Even if another PC is the one who sort of speaks about or speaks to or takes part in the social encounter. Just knowing who the target is will actually determine a couple of things. One thing, obviously, that they might be surprised about the fact that they're not dealing with the person who they thought that they were going to be dealing with, which can throw some boost die from the player's direction. As well as that it gives an idea of how the conversation can be twisted to, to get what they want. So your motivations are pretty important when it comes to your social encounters, more so than stats, I think.
Yeah.
So, know who is taking part in that social encounter and know what their motivations are.
I think that's really, really good advice.
Yeah, solid. I think some advice for it's fair to say a lot of what we're talking about is GM focused.
Yeah.
But I think for players in this situation too, it's very easy to forget who your character is. And if you're going back to what we were saying before, if you're a more charismatic player, it's sometimes easy to forget that you have a presence one.
Yeah, it can.
If you're entering a scene, try and play to that. It can be a lot of fun to play your character as a less charismatic person, because it's role playing. You're not playing a less charismatic person is equally as role playing. It's equal role playing as playing a highly charismatic person.
But being low charisma doesn't necessarily mean you're a bumbling oaf.
No, not at all. Like I know playing times in Dragon Squadron, like my character would say something really, really eloquent. Then I realised that he's presence one. So then I rephrase what he says to be like a grunt and like a real like dry presence one thing to say.
I am Groot kind of thing.
No,
you pull no punches.
Instead of being nice and polite, he'll be more like, get out of my way, because it's presence one. But sometimes it's hard to step back a gear. If you're a nice, polite person, it can be hard to drop down into that presence one gruff, hardcore guy. So let that happen. Look at your character sheet and remember who your character is and allow yourself to play in that.
I think that goes down to any stat, not just presence. And I know the presence probably is the thing that, and I think it's a throwback to charisma that everybody
intellect,
uses
though.
that. Intellect.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Cunning, all of your non-physical stats, even your willpower. Those non-physical stats, they're the ones that sort of people don't necessarily think about that are going to be, associated with that sort of social encounter, especially intellect, because, it's easy for us, because most people who play these sorts of games are fairly intellectual, I would suggest. So you've got people who, you've got a character who might have an intellect of 1, but the player at the table, will have a higher intellect than that. I'm not going to put a number on people's intellect. But
it's because ours is off the charts.
Negative is good, right?
No. The character creation, you can't go above, 5?
Yeah,
we
sorry
did.
about that. That sounds like an introduction to the next episode. Anyway, so what I'm suggesting is that you let your social attributes, whether it be your intellect, your cunning, your willpower, or your presence, use that to guide how you're playing your character.
Because really, this all contributes to the scene. This
Ultimately.
is,
One last thing for social encounters. I think social encounters is one of those, is probably the encounter you will prepare for the least. Unless you know the players are going to a court to argue a case. Social encounters will probably come up when you're not really expecting them to.
Yeah.
So don't sit down and think, well, how am I going to plan out all these social encounters? Just let them happen.
Yeah.
Yep, that's right. And what I guess a rule of thumb, and I know that it goes back to the skill level that you should be using, is to, if you're just wanting a general one, just have an idea, whether it be 3 or a 4, depending on how hard you want to make it.
Yep.
As far as their base attribute or their highest attribute that you think that they would be using in the encounter. So if you've got somebody who is definitely going to be, the person who's, conniving or whatever else, we'll think cunning. If somebody's going to be, all la-di-da, I guess you'd be looking more at sort of at presence.
Is that an official rule?
Like that. That's not an official rule, no. No.
I was going to say I don't have any skills in that.
That's a talent in Realms of Terranor.
Oh, they do.
You would like to think so. But yeah, so utilize that, I think.
When we were talking before about some advice for players, because designing things is very much a GM one as well. I think it's just really important that in each of these encounters, you might have characters that have strengths in each of these different types of encounters. You might have a very combat-heavy character or a very face-heavy character. Yep. But that shouldn't deter you from participating in each of those ones. This is role play. It's not roll the dice play.
Yep.
It's not you've got yet two yellow dice in here, so you're the one who should be going and talking to the person. Amazing things can happen if it's right for your character, even if they don't have the necessary skills to do whatever the encounter is. Give it a go. You never know, you might succeed, and it's a cool moment.
Well,
so it's just one of those things to consider for as a player in each of these things.
And not every social thing involves a check anyway. Yeah. So it's your chance to really step in with your guy who's not normally a face character and really get behind the steering wheel of his social aspect and have some fun.
Yeah.
Because ultimately it's what looks good on film.
Yeah.
And sometimes failing can look really good on film.
Absolutely.
Create the best adventures.
But there's one thing that, and I know that, I've heard it so many times where people sort of like look around the table and sort of say, oh, who's got the highest stat in whatever? And that's kind of what you're talking about.
That's right.
Is that you don't allow that. As a GM, stop people while they're doing that and say, okay, don't think of it like that. Don't think of your character in terms of numbers. Mm-hmm. Look at your character as in terms of how would they approach this particular scene or this particular encounter.
And that might be that they turn to the guy that knows computers and say, well, you're better at this than me.
This is what I'm looking for. Let me help you.
Yeah.
While you do this for me. And then you do a combined check or something.
Exactly. Don't let it stop you from trying.
Yes.
And all that it takes is just, even if you've got all greens, just takes a flip of a story point, and suddenly you've got a rank in it, and you can roll a triumph.
But I'm going to throw out a perfect fun example of someone entering a social encounter knowing that they're probably going to fail, but they did it for the lols and it ended up being one of the really most memorable moments of role playing. Years back when playing Pathfinder, my housemate Caleb, his character was a very brutish fighter type. I can't remember the exact details of his character. He had his social prowess was pretty well in the negatives. However, he played his character really, really well. His character didn't know he was socially incapable because his character was confident in his ability. And
part of the problem.
Essentially, his character got framed and he found some stolen wares in a trunk at the end of his bed. And he tried to nip it in the bud. He took the stolen wares to the local sheriff and said, I didn't steal these. I was framed. And his social checks went so badly, they ended up imprisoning himself in jail.
He turned himself in.
Wow. And it would have been fine if he didn't try the social check. However, he tried. He ultimately failed, but it was a fun, entertaining moment for everyone. And it created a new plot hook of trying to get him out of jail.
So yes, so don't be deterred, I think is what we're saying by your stats. Just look at it and go, what would be the most fun?
In any encounter.
In
Not
any
just
encounter.
social,
No,
any of
I
it.
agree.
If you're not a very good at driving, still jump behind that wheel if someone needs to go around and start shooting. It can happen.
I think this leads us into vehicle encounters.
It does.
That wasn't planned.
So let's look at vehicle encounters, because vehicle encounters are a different thing altogether, and it can be done really easily. It's very, very intimidating for some reason, and I think it's because people have generally got this idea that if it doesn't run like it does in the films, there's something wrong with it.
Or you need to get the models out on the table in order to measure the distance between each different round, how far the car's gone. And,
Exactly.
the
I mean,
different
yes, you
distances.
can do that,
Of course.
but ultimately you don't need to.
Yeah.
And I think that vehicle encounters themselves, in my opinion, are very, very easy to run. But if you're a beginning GM and you've never had a vehicle encounter before, and it's going to look a bit weird when you don't have miniatures on the table, don't be intimidated by that. No. Just know that, especially with Genesys, that all of the range bands pretty much are all exactly the same when it comes to vehicle combat versus standard combat.
Just on a larger scale.
Genesys did it that way so that there is no longer this confusion that Star Wars had, where there was engaged, but there was also close range. So they got rid of that. So it does make a lot more sense from a language perspective.
The scales are still different, but it's a lot clearer now.
Yeah, absolutely.
The vehicle rules, if you were playing Star Wars before, you sort of steered clear of vehicle rules because there was let's be honest, there was some weird ambiguity and odd things with the vehicle rules in the Star Wars rules. They still worked.
They worked well enough, yeah.
However, there was a few parts that sort of made you scratch your head, especially if you're new to it. However, Genesys have gone through the vehicle rules. Right. FFG have recognised that some things needed clearing up and patching up and tidying up, and they've done that. And it's a whole lot more streamlined, which is fantastic.
Agreed.
But it's the same way that we've talked about the other encounters. There's lots of different ways that you can do them. You could do hacking in a very combat style way where it can take you could take a whole session to try and do, or you could do it without even a dice roll. Same thing can happen with vehicle encounters. You could do, if it's a very important vehicle encounter or it's a race or something like that, you could have it as an initiative run and do the encounter that way. Or you could do it as a skill challenge and have it narratively described about the two cars going between, or vehicles doing that.
This is, because vehicle encounters cross over a lot with all of the other things that we've talked about. There can be combat, there can be social,
a drive-by.
And there can be hacking encounters from a car.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think one of the things that are a little bit more unique is the chase scene or the race. And when we look at those sort of things, I think we need to talk more about how it's more narrative. And how you portray that to the players for this sort of encounter.
I think when it comes to vehicles, the key to making an interesting vehicular encounter is environment. Because that's going to determine a lot of how the players describe what's going on narratively. So 2 speeders, flying neck and neck down a city street is going to be different to 2 speeders flying through the trees of Endor, that sort of thing.
You want to
So you want to make your encounters interesting. Focus on, if you're wanting one thing to focus on your environment, because that's going to determine how interesting your chase is going to be.
Yep.
The other thing as well is with vehicle encounters is if, say, for example, it just kind of happens. You were in a social encounter and one of the characters decides to kind of run, and he runs and jumps on a bike and goes. It's so easy to kind of go, oh, okay, I grab a bike. What kind of bike do I have? What's the stats for my bike? Don't get bogged down in models and things like that. If someone does say that, ask them what model they're doing, but just keep it super generic. The same way that you would your NPCs or any other thing can work with equipment just as nicely.
It also comes down to in vehicles. In a lot of vehicle combats, you don't actually need a stat block for the vehicle.
Not at all.
If you're doing a car chase, the stat block of the vehicle is irrelevant. All you need is your driving skill.
I think actually GM Hooley had a really good example of when vehicles happen, how you quickly just put down the stats of everything being 2 or something like that on a vehicle.
Effectively, you don't. All that you really need is handling. That's because that adds boost. So it can be something simple as, okay, I look for a vehicle before combat. Sort of, if you're just jumping onto a vehicle or something like that, and you just go, okay, make a perception roll. Or make a mechanics roll or something like that, that is just a very quick thing that can then determine how good your bike was. So if you've bombed the check, you can go, well, there is one.
There's a horse.
Actually,
a horse could be pretty good, but not against a speeder, which would be very interesting.
Or it can be something, something very, very simple.
I'm looking for a motorbike. Okay, cool. Make a perception check. Sweet. I passed with 2 threat. Oh, you found a motorbike. It's a postman's motorbike, however. You've got 2 threat on that check. It's got -2 handling.
Yep. Exactly.
Simple as that. Determines your threat level, determines the threat or advantage level, determines the handling of the vehicle.
And that can also play into the speed, the upper limits of the speed of the vehicle as well.
Absolutely.
Which are the 2 stats that you really sort of need to know.
That's it. And you don't need to worry about hull and damage threshold.
You don't know. You don't need it.
If there's rocket launchers and stuff going on about the players, or they're actively taking real serious damage. But you can really let the handling of your vehicle, what you roll, describe what you find. If you find a -4 vehicle, it's quite clearly a truck. Which is,
I was looking for a motorbike. I found a truck.
Exactly. But a truck has the innate ability of being probably a little bit tougher than a sports car. So, cool. You're probably going to win that chase, but you can ram them off the road a little bit easier.
But ultimately, those sorts of things are only going to determine additional boost dice to your check.
And it's going to add
they aren't that important. They're really not. And if a PC says, I want to go and find the closest bike, well, the only bike that you can find is a 0. Oh, can I make a mechanics check to see if I can find a better one? Or as Mike said, you make a perception roll or whatever. Streetwise or whatever.
Streetwise is a good one, yeah.
Any sort of check that you then say, okay, well, fine. You find one with a +2 or a +1 or whatever. Move on. It's not important really to the check, because what you're wanting to get into is the chase encounter.
You cut to the chase, if you will.
I see what you did there.
It'd be great though. Your player gets all caught up in shopping around for a vehicle. The bad guy gets away.
Exactly right. It's kind of like when Anakin and I'm sorry, Mike, to refer to episode 2 here.
That's fine.
But
think of you less of you now.
But that whole scene, which I think is probably one of the best parts of the film, is that scene where Anakin jumps in the speeder while Obi-Wan is grabbed onto the droid trying to find out who tried to assassinate Padme. That whole thing was just grab the best vehicle you could possibly find.
Yeah.
And run with it from there.
Or the pod race in episode 1, where it's all the environment that you're talking about and the sabotage between the players and the other players, between the other characters in the race. That all adds to it.
Yeah. And let's, of course, not forget the almighty story point, which can obviously also be used to give whatever PC the sort of ship that they want, or in the case of a GM flipping a story point, that the GM can say, well, all that's available is just some sort of bomb that's on the side of the road.
Another thing worth mentioning with vehicle combats too, or vehicle encounters, vehicles can sometimes be an environment. For example, if you're fighting on top of a train, sure, there's a vehicle in there, but you ultimately, unless you jump in the controls of that train, the fight on top of that train is not a vehicle combat unless something happens for you to control that train. It's all that train is a set dressing.
And I think that's one of the key things to remember when you're doing any sort of vehicle encounter is that you're always moving. Is that there is
momentum.
It's not, and it comes across. It keeps it keeps the game flowing. There is a sense of urgency because things are happening constantly. And if you forget about that, it's going to take away or detract from the scene.
And if you keep that in mind too, that sense of momentum and urgency, you can really use your players' advantages and threats really coolly. Like
Changing the scene.
Well, changing the scene's one, or again, back on the train, for example, player mate rolls a despair in their check. They happen to notice that there's a overpass coming that none of them are going to make unless they dive to the ground or jump off the train.
Or get inside.
Or get on the train. Get inside the train. They've got a round to open the hatch and jump inside because at the end of next round, the train's going to go into the tunnel and everyone's going to be smushed if they don't get into the train.
Yeah.
So it's that sense of urgency you can really manipulate as a GM and force down the players' throats, which is really cool.
I always look at any sort of vehicle encounters kind of like a film. Well, I look at everything like it as a film. But generally speaking, if you're not describing how things look outside, all that you're looking at is a green screen.
Yeah.
You need to be describing what it's going to be like in post-production, effectively. So always bring up what is happening on the outside, and the players should be doing that as well.
Yeah,
And but they'll respond.
Oh, absolutely. It's monkey see, monkey do type thing.
If you set the scene for your players, this goes for all encounters, but I think combat encounters, especially because there is that momentum, players will latch on to what's going on around them and really use the environment or whichever.
Or lack thereof if they're in space.
Or
that's true.
Even in space, there's no reason not to have environment. Asteroids, atmosphere.
Yeah.
Star Wars space, for example, there's asteroids every 2 feet. So
It's not empty.
There's always something going on. Or space worms. And you just you give your players the playground, and they'll really sort of latch onto that and run with it.
But also in space, you have the ability of not just like vehicles and going forwards and backwards if you're on a planetary scale, but you can go up, down, sideways, lots of different ways that you can use your vehicles and, not just planetary, but outside.
Exactly.
Outside
But
the
one
world.
of the interesting things that isn't covered in Genesis, and I'm sure that it will turn up eventually, is chases. It actually doesn't cover chases, which I was quite surprised with. But if you're after chases, obviously you can go and find Edge of the Empire or Age of Rebellion or Force and Destiny, which does have them in there. And that's a really handy thing to have because it's very, very quick and easy. And it means that it kind of almost becomes a skill challenge. And again, it goes down to vehicle combat can be skill challenges as well. Because, it doesn't necessarily need to be a full-on combat. It can be fun. I find that vehicle combat is always, especially when PCs are trying to board certain ships that are like in orbit.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I've never played a character.
No.
Was sensible, spacefaring adventurers.
Yeah, jumping out of shuttles with vibro axe wielding transitions. That's that's never happened. No. Anyway, so vehicle combat should be the highlight effectively of an encounter. So there you go. So we've talked about tonight combat encounters, hacking encounters, exploration in investigative encounters, social encounters, and vehicle encounters. Any final words, Mike?
Obviously, everything we've discussed has been, very broad strokes. There's so much to cover. If you zoom in, or rather enhance, on each of these subjects, we can talk about it for hours.
Yep.
And eventually we would like to do that. But I think we probably fed everyone a fair bit of our sort of working knowledge of how to make encounters fun and interesting.
Yeah, not just as GMs when designing them, but also playing in them and running those encounters as well.
And I think what we've talked about here also gives players who may not necessarily GM a little bit of a peek behind the curtain.
Yep. Yeah.
See what's going on there as well. Make them appreciate it a little bit more, maybe.
I think my final thought is just remember to keep each player involved in the scene.
True. Agreed.
Always have something for everyone.
And look around the table and someone's
twiddling their thumbs.
Yeah, Go, hey, you there, do something.
Yeah, throw them a bone.
Yep, exactly.
You literally keep a bone at the table. You throw up their head.
Or a really heavy D20.
No bone. No.
Right, okay, all right. The Dice Ball podcast does not endorse using violence at your table.
I like our new logo. No bone. Must be bone. Always bone.
So, Caitlin, any final thoughts?
So for me, looking at encounter design, it was one of those ones that when I very first started was probably one of the most intimidating parts of actually GMing, because or you can either go to how do you know where the emphasis should be, or how do you know how to do that beforehand? And the short answer is you don't. You feel it. It's RPG. It goes with the flow. No matter what you design, your players are always going to come up with something else, because that is just how it works.
That's what happens.
And being a player, primarily myself, I love doing that as best as possible. Not intentional, but my characters generally have a way of just messing everything up. But I think for me, one of the final thoughts on this type of topic is it doesn't have to be hard. It can be fun. Play to your characters. I know I've just said a couple of them there, but probably the biggest one is consider your characters and how they'd interact, and role play it. Don't roll the dice, play it.
Yeah.
Agreed. For me, I think the most important part is just relax. As a GM, just relax. The players don't understand what goes on behind, or don't see, should I say, what goes on behind the screen. So don't be sort of intimidated that you have to have, the correct stats for this particular creature or this particular vehicle. The players don't know. The players don't need to know. And for the most part, the players don't care. As long as they're having fun and being entertained at the table, that's great. And this system in particular allows the players to create their own fun, because they're so much more connected with the narrative of the story. So, yeah.
Which I'd like to add as well to that is just listen to your players.
Yep.
They'll write half the story for you.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Wouldn't it be terrible if this happened? Oh, no. It would be.
That would not be the first time I've done that.
Scratching a pen from behind.
But yeah. So, all right. Well, great discussion, guys. Now, to our listeners, if you have a topic that you would like us to discuss, let us know via email at info@thedicepodcast.com, or you can send us a message via Facebook or even Twitter.
I think we have some questions.
Yes, we do. What are we going to call that?
Question time.
Question time?
Come on, guys. I think it's behind the screens.
Yeah.
Behind the screens.
And welcome to Behind the Screens, where we, the hosts of the show, will answer your games and rules questions regarding the Genesys role-playing game. And tonight we've got some pretty interesting questions, only two tonight.
But they are interesting.
But they are very interesting indeed.
Interesting.
So who's our first question from tonight? Caitlin.
So we have a question from JR, who asks, I am designing a fantasy punk setting and wanted to subvert the stereotypical elf found in most fantasy games. I ended up with a race of hermaphroditic people who changed with the seasons. Their skin models different colours in summer, spring, fall and winter, like leaves on a tree essentially. I wanted one of their costumes to be planting a seed in the navel of their young when they hit puberty. As the child grows, the seed wraps around their bodies in vines and leaves and adapts to that child's personality. For example, a warrior elf might have hardened vines and armor-like leaves, etc. So my questions are, how might you work the changeability of the race into their stats? Can their bonuses or strengths and weaknesses change depending on the season? And is that too much crunch? There's further question being, how might you stat out an elf's seed suit, for lack of a better term currently? Would that just be treated as clothes? Thanks for taking the time. Keep up the great work. We will. That wasn't in the quote. That's what I'd say.
So I think we had a little bit of a discussion about this before we started today, and I think we've come up with sort of two different ways that we would approach it. Personally, for myself, I think that the whole changing with the seasons, I think it's more of a narrative sort of a thing that you might do, that their colours and their leaves and things like that might change over time. However, we might roll that as well into the effects of their suit, because I was sort of suggesting that you might select when you're creating the character as part of their race several different options for their suit. You might select the warrior package or the the entertainer or what have you. But part of that would the effects of that might change depending on the season. So it's one thing that changes and has several options, rather than two elements on the race that are mutable, which might be a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
However, Mike had another idea.
Well, my idea was pretty similar to GM Flano's. Basically, you have your seed suit is a package. Essentially, you buy.
Yep.
You have your warrior one. Your not knowing this guy's setting is a little bit tricky, but your diplomatic one from well, et cetera, et cetera. Each of those give you different buffs, and I think they don't necessarily be anything too crazy. Like the warrior suit could give you a bonus soak, or the diplomatic one could give you a bonus boost dice to social checks you make. Examples. Very simple, very basic rules. And my suggestion for the seasonal change is to have, depending on how many seasons you have, say if you've got 4, if you have 4 effects that apply only when the season is occurring. So if it's winter, this effect occurs on the character.
Yeah.
It's more or less exactly what GM Flano has suggested, except I've just separated the two. So a person in a warrior suit will always have the benefits of a warrior suit. However, if they're in summer, the additional effect is a little bit different. Ultimately, I think both GM Flano and I agree upon is the actual stats, like i.e. the characteristics and the derived attributes, shouldn't really change. That should always be the same. The effects of the suit and the seasonal differences, depending on which way you want to go, they should be very minor but very characterful buffs.
I would have to agree with the two of you most definitely in regards to how that should be handled. That you have, similar to the way that Terranos does it, similar to the way that we did it with the werewolves, is that you have base stats, and then for the suit, you might have a choice at character generation of one of 4 or however many that you decide to have. And then as the seasons change, just make small changes that are applicable to whatever season that you have. And that may just be like a 5-point thing to put it into species generation terms, that just either provides an additional point of soak or a boost die or something like that.
Minor. And you want, and if you're building this species, no matter which direction you go, if you go roll into one, like GM Flano's suggestion, or the 2 different effects, only pay for it once. Yeah. Because if you can only have one season at a time, so its cost shouldn't be calculated 4 times once for each season.
Exactly right.
So it's obvious, but it's worth pointing out just in case,
Caitlin, what's your thoughts?
I think for me, I'm not great at statting out things or the rules or the mechanics behind stuff, but as in terms of actually seeing something like this come through, in terms of what everyone was saying about keeping it subtle, I think that is actually really important, and particularly with you as a GM and how you're going to change seasons and how often that takes place. I mean, I know when in some encounters that we've had or some adventures, it could take place over a couple of days, even though you might have hours and hours worth of sessions. Like the narrative itself only takes a couple of days versus other adventures that could take you up to years in terms of how you've played. So I think as a GM, you need to consider about the impacts of the changing of the seasons that it's going to have for the characters and their interactions with each other, as well as the environment and the world that you've created. So creating suits or creating stats that are super buffy, not Vampire Slayer, but in terms of upping people's stats, can really impact how your narrative is going to take place, particularly when that changes. And how that's going to happen with your character. So you've got a character that, if you do make it uber combat in one area and then all of a sudden in the next season and then they're not doing combat, it could be a way of disengaging characters if you have it too much or too little within your stats, basically.
And it sounds like the change of seasons in your world, JR, is fairly seminal. So you want to, when it happens, you obviously know this because you're creating the world, but make sure your players know. Make it a big deal.
Yeah.
Because it's going to affect the characters.
And try and keep it as even as possible. You don't want to have 6 sessions of one season and then 1 session of another season. I mean, narratively, that could potentially make sense, but you kind of want to even it out so everyone has a chance to fully play with their suits.
Well, you know, it'd be cool if this is JR's campaign, but we're running with it. He's giving it to us, so whatever.
He's given it to us. That means our imagination
That's
goes
it.
wild.
If each season of his campaign took place in a different season.
Ooh.
So season 1 is in winter, season 2 is in summer, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
And if anybody's interested in looking at season design, not just episode design, you can go and look at the latest book from Star Wars. Yeah, Dawn of Rebellion actually has an entire segment in the back which actually talks about designing seasons and how they should look. And it's really quite interesting. Go and take a look at that
That's
if you
the
haven't already.
last place I would expect to find that, to be 100% honest.
Really?
I understand, I get it, because it's Rebels, but it's such like a narrative thing. You'd think you'd find that in a core book, not a side Star Wars book.
Yeah, but no, it's very, very interesting. I had a good read of it on the plane on the way back.
I like seeing those sort of things in books.
It's cool. But just a weird place to see it.
Yeah.
But anyway, so take a look at that. And so for our second question tonight, Huz.
Well, it's a fresh one. It's very fresh. It's our friend Edward Kelly. I think he's written him before. He asks, in the Terranoth book, there are 2 talents, grapple and tumble. Grapple says that you spend 2 strain to cause engaged allies to spend 2 maneuvers to disengage from you. However, the tumble talent says that you can disengage from engaged enemies as incidental. How do these 2 talents work against each other? That's a really good question, because both really do oppose one another.
Yeah, and I mean, you might not end up against an NPC that necessarily has the opposing one, but you might as well. It could happen.
It could happen.
How do we handle that?
Well, it's a good question.
That's probably why Edward decided to send it through send it through.
I think that this is a question that when we have one of the developers on the show, we will definitely ask for an official answer.
Yeah.
But when we've sent Edward a response because it was pretty prompt that he needed a response by.
Yeah.
But honestly, the rules as written. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
They don't kind of work.
Well, okay. Rules is written.
Conflict.
It almost says that the tumble will override grapple because you can just disengage. You've spent, I think you spent 2 strain for tumble and you disengage. So it sort of overrides grapple. However, that really leaves the bad, especially if this is player versus player, that leaves a bad taste in your mouth.
And I'm your friend, I immediately want to argue with this view. So I can imagine this would be a pretty hot topic for 2 players at another table. So I don't think there is any hard defined answer we can derive from this. There's going to be an argument either way, I think.
Yeah, and especially because one of them, I think, is a higher tier talent than the other. You kind of want to rule...
Yeah, it's a can of worms if you go tier-wise.
But I think we want to look at the intent of the talent.
Yep.
And I think you were saying before when we first got this, and the answer that we've sort of given is that... Tumble, it's essentially giving you the use of a maneuver as an incidental.
Yeah, exactly.
And the intent of grapple is that it requires 2 maneuvers to get away.
Yeah.
2 maneuvers to do a maneuver, essentially.
That's
to do a maneuver, yeah. So what was the answer then?
Well, so my suggestion is that you change the wording of grapple slightly, and you say that to disengage from an enemy requires an additional maneuver than normal. So if you do it normally, it would be to maneuver away from someone to disengage. It would be 1 maneuver. So if you've got the grapple talent, if you've spent your 2 points of strain, that it takes 2 maneuvers. But if you've then got the tumble, which says that you disengage as an incidental, well, what it's saying is that that still works, but it's still going to take you 1 additional maneuver to do that.
It's a good halfway point, and I think it'll satisfy 2 players or 2 PC and NPC really nicely.
I think it'll be interesting to see what the FFG developers say about that, and it may end up being errata, I don't know.
I think it might very well be like this, to be honest. I think it's a good, clean way of doing it.
I think it's a clean way of doing it.
But, man, points to Edward Kelly. Astute perception on that man for finding that so quickly in this fairly new set of rules. So
very good.
Well, I mean, it's the sort of logic that you can apply to anything in this game. If something doesn't necessarily agree, find a halfway point, satisfy both people.
Yep, exactly. So I think that that brings us to the end of a great show, guys. I was pretty impressed with that. Sorry, it went for a little bit longer, but I think that there's a lot in that as far as encounter design goes, and hopefully that our listeners get a good deal of information. And if you do have any questions in regards to what we've spoken about tonight, questions, comments, queries, by all means, jump on Facebook. Let us know. That's probably our main point of contact. We also do have Twitter and whatever else as well.
And the emails.
That's true. But when it comes to interacting with other fans within the community, definitely Facebook is the place to be. So that's a wrap, I think. Thanks everybody for taking part in tonight, and thank you the listeners for listening to us banter on. I'm GM Hurley.
I am GM Huz.
I'm GM Flano.
And I'm GM Caitlin.
And together we are the Dice Pool Podcast, where adventure is just a roll away. The Dice Pool Podcast is a proud member of the D20 Radio Network. For more information about the network, visit www.d20radio.com. The Dice Pool Podcast is a fan-generated podcast. All of the information provided on the podcast and related website are not affiliated with Fantasy Flight Games or any of their licensors. The content of this podcast remains the property of the Dice Pool Podcast and is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The Genesys role-playing game, the Genesys logo, content and all material remain the property of Fantasy Flight Games.